Great. Well, I hit 1 o'clock according to my clock. So I am just going to jump right into it. We have several people on deck for you to hear from, and want to just get right to it because we only have 60 minutes. 60 minutes to go. So I would like to just get us started off. I'll talk about our agenda really briefly and then throw it to Amelia. So a few housekeeping things. I'm Katie Miller. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at ALEA, and I will be kind of guiding us through the next hour, work closely with all these wonderful people in our ALEA Unsystem Innovation Cohort. I wanted to do like a few tech things. So we chose Zoom meeting for this webinar so that it was a little bit more interactive. So feel free to play with the active speaker view and gallery view as we're going. If you have chosen active speaker view, then you will see not only the PowerPoint, but a larger version of whoever is speaking, if that's something that's interesting to you. If it's just gallery view, you could see all the folks logged in at the top, and you can just scroll through that. This webinar will be recorded and also posted on the website, so you will have access to this afterward. Feel free to leave your camera off, turn it on. We love to see faces, but I know it's not always time to be seen. So we'll just leave that up to you, but you will be automatically muted. Please feel free to use the chat throughout the hour with questions or comments or any thoughts that you want to add. We will do our best to get to them throughout the hour, and if we don't, we'll follow up with you. So, and it just gives us an idea of sort of what you all are thinking about, and that's really helpful. One of our presenters in the middle is actually going to be calling in, so I just wanted to let you know that. We just want to thank you so much for being here. We have a number of cohort members, so it's just sort of throughout, if you want to just kind of give a wave. If you're on gallery, great. Great. Hi, Tracy. I see you. Terrific. Give a little wave if you're a cohort member. Just in the interest of time, we won't go through and introduce every single person, but on this first slide here, you will see, if you haven't read it already before or have visited our website, you can find the full year 1 practice report, and you can read and get to know more about each of our cohort members. So with that, Amelia Frank-Meyer is our CEO at ALEA, and she will do some further introductions about who we are and about the Unsystem and our cohort.
Great, thanks, Katie. So welcome everyone. We're so glad to have you here. I'm Amelia Frank-Meyer, and I'm just going to do a little intro to who we are and invite you to really participate. So we hope the chat is active, ask your questions, share your comments, share your best practice and learnings as well. So we really consider ourselves a learning community. So a brief introduction to ALEA for those of you who aren't familiar with us. ALEA is a Minnesota-based nonprofit. We work all over the country and in Canada, and we have some of our Canadian friends on the call here I see today. Hello, Arlene. And the work we do, we center around a framework that we call Know Better, Do Better, Be Better. So we do a lot of work in building knowledge and ahas about new ways of work. We do work side by side with our partners in workforce well-being, in strategy for transformational change, and in leadership supports and coaching, as well as helping youth who are in the system because of our old ways of work to find permanency. In the B part of our Know Do Be is our R&D lab. And in our R&D lab is the Unsystem Innovation Cohort. And in a second, I'll tell you how that came to be. But essentially, we're working with a group of public partners around the country who are interested in building a proof of concept, in building ways to keep children safely with rather than from their families, and to demonstrate that public child welfare agencies can in fact become primary prevention agencies and build new ways of work together. So I just wanted to give you a quick intro and also to give a shout out to some of our board members. I see on the phone today, on the webinar today. I see for sure Indra and Corey, and if there are others that I'm missing because I can't scroll fast enough, welcome to the ALEA staff and board members as well. So a quick ditty on how we got where we are and what the heck this thing is about. So if you want to go to the next slide, Katie, or whoever's doing that for me. So at ALEA, we're really interested in building new ways of work in child welfare and moving away from our current system, which isn't producing the desired outcomes. I think a lot of people would agree on that. A system that's set up on an old set of assumptions that we know now to no longer be true. And to really redo the way we do work, to build new ways of work that involve leaning into empathy and working with families to really design their own futures. And so because we knew we weren't going to figure this out in our back room alone, in May of 2017, we invited 100 innovators from around the country. We took applications and selected 100 who represented 10 different groups. One group was federal and tribal child welfare leaders. One was state child welfare leaders. One was county child welfare leaders. One was nonprofits. One philanthropists. One innovation fellows like Bush, Ashoka, MacArthur. One group was folks with lived experience, and it turned out about a third of the designers for building a new way of work had lived experience, either losing children to the child welfare system or growing up in care. So you get the idea, a bunch of different groups of folks, 10 tables of 10, one of kind of each representative group at each table. And over the course of 4 days, we work with our friends and partners at IDEO, who I see are on the call too, hello Aneta, and ask the question, how might we build a better child welfare system? And I'll give you an insight into the answer. After 30 prototypes were developed and we coded all of them to see what they had in common, the answer was largely, you've asked the wrong question. We don't need to build a new or better child welfare system. We need to undesign a system and bring the decisions and the work much closer to families. That the perfect child welfare system already exists. It's called the family, and every child is born into it. The challenge is that sometimes families struggle, like mine does, like yours does. And the question becomes, what do we do then? When families struggle, what do we do to keep them safely together? So this group of folks you see pictured on the slide here came together to design that idea of what we would do instead. And we call that idea an unsystem because we don't know what it will be called. I've heard it called the family strengthening system, the family well-being system. Who knows what we'll finally settle on? We just know it's not this system. So it's the opposite. It's an unsystem. To let us know if we're really living and applying those principles, we have kind of these guiding principles here that are indicators of whether or not we are building that new way of work. And they are to protect relational connections is sacred. We only disrupt connections between a child and their family when it is absolutely, the very last as a nuclear option, as in we are working to come to a place where we never do that, that we don't do that. Nurturing the capacity for joy in people we serve and in each other, that this work shouldn't diminish your own capacity to parent and partner and live well as joy being a sign of safety for those we serve. Insisting on racial equity and radical inclusion, acknowledging the past pains and hurts of the child welfare system as it is structured on a false set of assumptions that Black, Brown, and Indigenous children fared better with whiter families and that poorer children fared better with wealthier families, and working to correct those in systemic barriers to that work with families. In addition, daring to share power with one another and our partners, working intergenerationally, so just removing children we all know doesn't work. I'm working with the whole family, trusting the wisdom of children and families to design their own futures. And then when you're not sure what to do what love would do. Do what you would do for someone you loved. So just a quick slide on this unsystem idea. This is out of the 10 of 10. For kids, we call that design event. The traditional child welfare system is based on an idea of worthiness. People don't deserve their kids. They don't deserve help. It's based on blame and shame and a cultural need to punish and disconnect families. And instead, an unsystem really is that built around supporting families to be safely together and all the elements and components that go into that. So what we had after the design event was a bunch of ideas, and we wanted to see what they looked like when they were in practice, operationalized, live on the ground. So we asked again for requests for innovators, asked systems who might be interested in building this way of work on the ground and in practice. We had 10 systems reply that they were willing to do this, and we tried to talk everybody out of it, and we were successful in talking 5 out and 5 stayed. And that's how they were selected. It was really about a commitment, a readiness, and a willingness to go forward, to try and try again and try again to build new ways of work. The Unsystem Innovation Cohort then is made up of Waupaca County, Wisconsin, Eau Claire County, Wisconsin, Cass County, North Dakota, Washington County, Maryland, and the Eastern Service Region of Iowa, which represents 10 counties. So 4 states, 14 counties from 5 jurisdictional leads. Every director or leader had a deputy or a second, and so from each jurisdiction, so that made 10, 5 jurisdictions with 2 leaders. And then we assigned a lived experience guide who could say that wouldn't work for me and mine, or you're missing the perspective of this way of thinking. And then a professional guide, someone who kind of knew what was going on in the field, knew about other innovations and efforts, and could whisper in the leader's ear, you can do this, or you can do more, or think bigger. And so that makes up the innovation cohort, about 20 people, 10 leaders and 10 guides who came together month over month for a year, then every other month. And now, of course, we're virtual in the current world in which we live to build new ways of work. The punchline here is that they did this without really new resources or new money. They did it without changing all of their laws or rules, and without changing roles. They really did it by changing their mindsets, shifting the way they thought about families, shifting the way they thought about the work. And over the course of about the first year of trying, they achieved a 12% reduction in foster care placements and a 37% reduction in residential placements. And so each system applied these techniques and changes in ways that met their own needs, trying and testing different ways of work. The Eastern Service Region of Iowa used child safety conferences. Waupaca had been at this a long time and reduced their numbers in deep end care and had started to build full-time front-end prevention to partner with families. You know, Eau Claire really focused on their residential population. Cass began reducing the number of kids they placed outside of families. And in Washington County, really trying to narrow that front door, showing a 61% reduction in the number of kids who were removed and coming into care. So I'm gonna pass this now to the next section, which is gonna be done by Diane Cable, who's the director at Eau Claire County, Wisconsin, and a cohort member and a brave and innovative leader. So happy to have you, Diane. Thanks for being here today.
Great, and let me just say, just before Diane gets started, just what the rest of the hour will look like. So we, in the cohort case study, came up with 5 sort of themes, insights that we had all together about how we did this work in the last year and a half or 2 years. And we have 3 of our 5 leaders to present 5 of the themes. So Diane will be talking first about preparing and taking care of yourself and your team. That was really important to every single one of the agencies. And then she will also talk about thinking differently about the work. So Diane, if you start speaking, then if you're on speaker view, we will see your face.
Are we good?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Amelia, and thank you, Katie. And hello to everyone. I'm Diane Cable. I'm the director here at Eau Claire County Human Services. And this probably emerged, this topic, as being one of the most important components of the mindset shift for me that I didn't expect. For me to be able to come to this work and practice each day to shift a system for family connections to always be preserved and strengthened, for me, it takes knowledge, understanding, strength, both physical and inner, perseverance, courage, tenacity, empathy, compassion, humility, a recognition of my own stuff that gets in the way, a willingness to let go and let others, incredible creativity, empathy, compassion, and love. Attention and awareness to all of these different components and other components as leaders really provides, I have learned, that mixture to be able to be responsive and adaptive to shifting this system. So as a leader working within a very well-established human services system, holding child welfare as part of our system, it is responding and reacting to challenges that are both internal, external, dealing with community, social factors, resource and funding impacts, and political, dealing with and responding to boards, policies, legislation, and many different cultural components, both internal and external. This is a lot to balance. And to be able to do that each and every day and each and every moment, for me, staying strong is essential. To be able to take care of myself is imperative. I must have good sleep. I must have good nutrition. It is a must to move. It is a must to have a professional and personal team that I can go to. And I know those folks will be there for me when I need them, to be able to either have my back or just to hug me and care for me. What I learned through this is that this is critical and essential. Not only for myself, but then for leading and caring for my staff and my organization. So I learned as the director and leader pretty quickly that all of our work is relational. Now, it's not that I didn't know this before, but this really hit home for me. That whether the work is task-focused or adaptive and process-focused, it is the how. It is the how that is so critical. The work expected of our team is absolutely tremendous. And we check in and avoid having conversations through email and aim for everything as much as we can to be in person. Although right now, a lot of that is virtual. We tend to our how through our daily operational processes with in-person connections and checking in with our teams and our leaders to make sure people are doing okay. This work is hard, and taking care of each other as we do it is essential. Now, COVID has presented some challenges. However, we continue to work on that. How can we care for our staff and our organization is essential in doing that well, so that for those who walk through our doors, we're prepared to be able to be with them through this time. We use the unsystem guiding principles and tenets from Speak Your Piece as our grounding principles to help us as we engage with our staff. We educate all of our staff on these principles. We engage in activities that prompt conversations, challenge each other, and help build relationships. We seek input from our staff on different types of questions, and have engaged in the crowdsourcing project, which allowed for us to get some incredibly innovative ideas from our staff about how we might think about approaching our work in different ways. And we spontaneously have engaged in activities of gratitude for our staff, and for our staff to show gratitude to each other. Today, we've evolved to having weekly communications from me, because many of our staff, about 80% of them, work remotely, and they miss being able to see and walk by each other to say hello. And so we intentionally connect virtually to be able to have people wave hello and say, how are you doing? And It allows us to also make sure that we're transparent and showing that we're vulnerable in this time and to show care. Our intention in those weekly conversations is not to flood through information, but also to just be intentional in seeing each other. We also hold connections and reflections meetings. Our trauma competent committee each week hosts and facilitates conversations with staff, raising a question, engaged in conversation and sharing points and resources with the entire agency. And we've initiated with ALEA well-being groups and strategy leadership sessions. And what I would say is that these three components, our weekly live meetings, our opportunities for staff to come together and have intentional conversations on a subject, and our well-being work have helped to ground us during this time that's ever changing and allows us to continue to focus on that system work. So as a leader, to be able to do all of this, it is really important that I'm really serious about taking care of myself, and that this isn't just feel-good stuff about getting my nails done, or if I ever get back to a salon to have my hair done. It's really about what it takes for me to be able to be present and come to the work and be with all. And it is incredibly critical for my staff and my organization to be well, so that as we face these challenges, we can do this with that shared focus together of helping to have family connections be able to be preserved and strengthened. So thinking differently about the work is really critical. And for Eau Claire to be able to challenge and ask people to consider other ways and challenge our thoughts and shift our mindset was very intentional through our vision. It requires our leaders and staff to be well and have a willingness to engage differently. Again, as I just said, this is really relational work, being able to come to the table and listen to each other. Now, some staff individually identify as already conducting their practice this way, and we know that it is a mindset shift for the system and operational practice to carry out the vision of family connections are always preserved and strengthened. And we have intentionally focused on that vision. That is our shift. We have done this and have learned that it takes people to do this mind shift. It takes people to be willing to be vulnerable, a great deal of trust, and relationships, trusting relationships with each other. What we've really learned is this is not easy, and we have to hang in there. We've provided ongoing training and intentional trainings both internally and externally. We've engaged in leadership book clubs. We do a lot of modeling with our leaders and our managers. We've been creative. We've had staff take one of the guiding principles and broken them up and intermixed them with different units, and have had them create videos and short movie clips to be able to show this is what it looks like from our perspectives of carrying out this guiding principle. There are a multitude of ways that we continue to work on our cultural, internal relationships and well-being with our staff. The process for carrying out our vision and to see that change occur has been and is the critical component is our relational work and that shared mindset to carry that out. This process and work is continuous, requires leadership to be well, to take care of themselves, for us to be able to take care of each other and to be able to best serve.
Diane, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Thank you for highlighting how absolutely foundational it is to have a core trust currency among your team and a well-being quotient that is high enough to be able to withstand really different thinking about how we do work in child welfare. Let's throw it to Tiffany Rexroad, who is, I believe, on the phone. Can you just give us a little, I'm here, Tiffany, if you're there. Tiffany is the Assistant Director for Adult, Child, and Family Services in Washington County in Maryland. Tiffany is here to talk about one strategy, one thematic strategy we had of making the old way of work harder and making the new way of work easier. So Tiffany, do you want to talk about how that looked a little bit in Washington County?
I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Off you go.
Okay. Thank you. Apologies to everyone. I had a time zone mix-up on my end, and that's why I'm on the phone and not with you on camera, and appreciate the flexibility. So part of what we had discovered along our learning was that sometimes if you can slow down the process and figure ways to make the old way harder, so to speak, you can allow time for creativity. So within child protection, I did child protection investigations myself for 7 years. And I know what it's like to be caught in the crisis, to be caught in the adrenaline. And that is such a contagious feeling that once that starts, it just kind of, passes. And the workers revved up and the supervisors revved up. And what we wanted to get away from was a situation in which two people who were, emotionally charged in the situation were making decisions on their own, and really took a look at what is the process around decision making in child removal, and what does that look like? How can we slow that down? How can we make sure that we are in frontal brain thinking? How can we make sure that we are considering all of our options? So if we have policies and procedures in place that speak to family engagement and bringing the family to the table to make decisions with us, and exploring relatives and, doing exhaustive searches, how do we make sure that in the crisis that all of those things have been followed? How do we slow it down and make sure that we're asking hard questions, that we really are saying to our workers in the field, tell me more about Dad. Tell me about Dad's resources. Tell me how we explored natural supports to the family, and really making sure that we are having those deliberate conversations around decision points. And also wanting to make sure that we're including multiple perspectives. So instead of, one worker or one supervisor really feeling like they're the sole decision maker and then they are then responsible for that, how can we include multiple perspectives in that decision? So, out of home is at the table. And often they're the folks saying, if we place this child, this is what we're looking at, and it may not be any safer than what we can do in the community. We have folks from our family services. We have folks with tremendous therapeutic backgrounds that can bring us perspectives from the work before they came to us. And we try to include that around the upfront decision making. And we in Washington County, we're able to find that when we're able to slow it down, we're able to take a closer look at really running out those alternatives around placement. We had historically looked back, and it's interesting if you look at your staff who are in child protection or do the work around removals, it was pretty consistent. That we had one or two staff doing most of the removals. Like, how is that possible? And I just wasn't convinced that they were getting all of the difficult cases. So it had to be something to their beliefs, or maybe their bias, or what is it that leads workers to the decisions. And so we wanted more voices in that. And also with respect to teaming and perspectives and keeping that as early as possible, we wanted to think about prevention. And literally within this past week, somebody had said to me, what is prevention? Like, what does that mean? And so it has forced us to have a conversation about what is prevention and what does that look like? And for me personally, I would say that prevention is preschool, and prevention is healthcare, and prevention is food security, and prevention is employment, and prevention is housing. And prevention are the things that families have that have nothing really to do with child welfare. And if we can help families stabilize in other ways, our working theory right now is that we can avoid things then becoming on a child welfare track. And so we've taken a look at some of school-based interventions to think, you know, fifth grade seems early, right? So if there's an attendance problem in fifth grade, let's address it, let's work on it. And that sounds early, but really it's not early enough. We should be thinking about, if we have a kindergartner or a first grader with attendance problem, how do we intervene as early as possible around school, you know, school-related things that we're seeing that happen very early in families. Or if we have people walk in our front doors, so our department is not just child welfare, there's lots of services that are offered there. And if we have someone that comes in and let's just say they need help with food security, or maybe it's a child support question, and there's other things happening in their life, let's not wait for this crisis to escalate and become a child welfare concern. How do we intervene right from the go, right from their first reach for help, to connect to the community, to connect to services, to provide what we can so that families have what we would want for our own families. Mm-hmm. So that's what I would share with you about some of the lessons that we learned around deliberately slowing it down, deliberately including multiple perspectives, and really saying, you know, what is prevention and how do we just keep going earlier and earlier and earlier.
Tiffany, thank you so much. I love how you just talked about slowing down, and you know, the things that we share here, I don't know that will, you know, doesn't require any advanced degrees to understand, and we just like piece it all together. And I mean, even when I hear these talk, I've been part of the cohort for 2 years, and even when they talk, I think what Kathy also stated in the chat, it just seems so simple, doesn't it? Some of it seems so simple, and it is. So I appreciate how you've talked about, Tiffany, just slowing down the process, and then you can actually have space to think differently, to ask different questions. We are going to now throw it to Lori Frick, who's calling from Iowa, and she is going to share with us a particular intervention that they have used in Iowa and some of the successes that they've had and how that looks exactly. And the last two themes that are covered in the case study that we'll share with here are trust families as the safe bet. We have just got to lean into the fact that families can make decisions for themselves, and then expanding the group of helpers. And Tiffany talked about that too. We just need some more perspective on this. So Lori, take it away.
All right, thank you. So I'm Lori Frick. I'm the service area manager for the Department of Human Services in Iowa. I cover a 10-county area on the east side of the state. Our state is a state-run system versus the other areas are all county-run. So I think in some respects we have maybe some advantages that way. Maybe there's some disadvantages too, but it certainly has been helpful in this circumstance. So what I want to talk about really first is how to get people, what we've done to kind of get our people prepped for the change in thinking that we did. So, and try to make it at least pretty short, but I have a leadership team that consists of about 7 other people. And in that team, we had to really have conversations around what does it mean to always strengthen and preserve family connections? And at what level of risk are you willing to take to do that? And so we had to have some pretty diligent conversations at that level before taking that concept to our staff that are on the front lines and our supervisors on the front lines to say, okay, are you willing to always strengthen and preserve family connections? Because when you're asking staff and people to do that, you're really asking them to take risks. And those risks sometimes are very difficult for people to be willing to step out to do. And so we had to really talk a lot about the philosophy with our staff, and most importantly, be very open to the feedback that they were willing to give, because the reality is they're not always going to be on the same page with you, and you have to be willing to listen to that and understand where they're coming from. So we took a lot of time to do that before we ever started getting into child safety conferences, which I will talk about in a minute. But part of also doing this is really, it's trusting our families as the safe bet. So you have to have some level of belief that families have strengths and families can figure out a best solution for them and their family. And we don't always have to be the ones to figure it out for them at the department. So getting them to really have a voice in these meetings that I'm going to be talking about, getting them to our staff to allow them to have a voice in really what we're going to do and the decisions that we're going to make was highly important. I really talked a lot to our staff about what is it going to take to, keep families together, because as somebody mentioned earlier, and it might have been Amelia, but we really want to do what's best for the families that we work with, and hopefully we would think about ourselves too and say, okay, what would we want for our own family? And if this is something that we would want, we want to do that for the families that we work with as well. So we got into, in our service area, doing child safety conferences, and it really was around keeping children safe, empowering families and parents, and letting them be a really main part of the decision making that we did. And so what child safety conferences essentially are is essentially a staffing or a conference that we do right when we have a social worker who is feeling as though they're in a situation where a child may need to be removed from the home. Not after they're removed, not when someone's already decided that it's going to happen, but when there's enough potential danger that we're saying we might be moving down that path. And so it kind of goes back to what Tiffany said, around slowing down, because we want people to slow down and think about the decisions that they're going to make, rather than just making sometimes what the easy decision historically would have been, which is let's get this kid placed into foster care. So we talked a lot, again, like I said, about slowing down. And so if there was a kid that was at a potential risk of removal, they would have to actually do what's harder, right? They have to call their supervisor and say, okay, supervisor, I'm thinking that we might have to remove a child. That supervisor then had to call what we call in Iowa a social work administrator. So they are the supervisor, and have a conversation around, do we have any other options? And that would lead to a child safety conference. And when we got to those child safety conferences, we really allowed for the family to be major decision makers and major contributors to those conversations about what do they think that they can do to help safely maintain their child in their home, because that was our ultimate goal. Our ultimate goal was not to remove the child. It was to figure out a plan that child can safely remain in the home with that parent or caretaker. As those conversations would go on in those child safety conferences, if it became evident that it was not possible to somehow keep that child in the parent's home, we would talk about, is there someone that could move into the home with them? Or on the next case would be, can the child go to somewhere else where the child already knows someone? So we call them fictive kin. So if they can't go to or stay with a parent, they would go to a fictive kin or a relative, and we would plan around that, versus, again, the step of being foster care. We didn't want to place a child into foster care and cause any undue trauma unless that was the last possible option. And so those child safety conferences really focus strictly on what is the safety issue and how can we prevent removal of that child from the home, or at an absolute minimum, making sure that the child doesn't go anywhere other than someone that they already know, whether it's a relative or fictive kin. We did those in a pretty quick time frame. So when we got the notification from a social worker that they were concerned that a child may need to be removed, we would have a child safety conference within 72 hours. It was pretty quick, and a lot of times we would do it before that 72-hour mark. But what we had to do was set the stage with the staff, and not only our staff, but also the providers that are in the homes doing work with families, to say, unless you have to be in court, or unless you're gone on vacation or you're sick, you're going to drop what it is that you have to do, and you're going to show up to this child safety conference, because this is your priority to make sure that this child can safely remain at home. And in the beginning, it was a little bit difficult for staff because they weren't used to just dropping everything and going, but they really have found that it is and has been really a best practice for the kids and their families. We've been very lucky that we have a partnership with the providers that do our in-home services, and they provide the facilitation of the conferences for us. So that's been a great bonus for us. And they've also then helped to make sure that those conferences stay family focused. As you can see on the slide, when it's looking at the data that we have collected through our child safety conferences, of those 222 children, by the time we had our first child safety conference at that 72-hour mark, we were able to maintain 214 of them either with their parent or caretaker, or with somebody that was familiar to them. We then do what's called a 10-day follow-up. And so within 10 days, we have another child safety conference to go over the plan and to ensure that kind of things are on track and hopefully maintain that child at home. As you can see, there was 211 of those children that were still in that either that relative home, fictive kin, or with their parent or caretaker. And when we did a 6-month study or 6-month follow-up, 74% of those kids were still in those placements and not then been placed in shelter or stranger foster care or group care. And that is better than our state average. Our state average is right around 52% at a 6-month mark. So we were pretty excited about some of the data that we were able to collect from there. Also in our 10-county area, we were able to significantly decrease the number of kids that were in foster care, as well as go from about 43 kids in group care down to 8 kids in a 10-county area in group care. So we're pretty excited about some of the things that we've done with that. We have really engaged our partners in this process too. So I talked about how we have a provider that does a facilitation, but we also have a program in our state called Parent Partners. And Parent Partners are like a lived experience that was mentioned earlier. And they come to the table too and help provide support to the families in child safety conferences. And that has been extremely helpful as well. One last thing that I want to share is that I think one of the reasons why we were able to be very successful in what we are doing is we had the leadership team members that I had mentioned earlier. They were very, very committed to this process. And so anytime that there was a child safety conference that was scheduled in that 72 hours or within that 10-day time frame, one of us from the leadership team also attended those. So we had a high-level administrator at those meetings. And that meant sometimes 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night. Sometimes it meant first thing in the morning, and it was 3 counties away. But we hopped in our cars and we went to those meetings and we supported our staff. And we helped them understand that when we're making decisions about keeping a child at home, where it felt maybe a little bit iffy for their staff, that we had their back and we were there to support them, so they didn't feel like they were out making those decisions all on their own. And that has been very helpful, I think, and very successful within our agency to do that. Again, our overall goal is to engage as many people as we can, as many informal supports as we can with this process, and do anything that we can to safely prevent removal for kids.
Lori, thank you so much for sharing all that. And I wish we could go deeper into all these things. I mean, one shared characteristic of what these folks are doing is to make this old way harder and make the new way easier, and to share the group of help, share the risk. It's not just one social worker who has the responsibility to it, and they don't have all the risk. And so it's asking different questions. It's thinking differently about the work. It's not, do we need to remove this child from his or her home? It's, what is it going to take? What is it going to take, team? What is it going to take, family? What is it going to take, agency, to keep this family safely together? So those are just some, and I really appreciate you sharing about that process, and are so pleased about the families in Iowa that have been able to remain safely together on behalf of your efforts. And there's similar work going on in other agencies. And I also do want to say that Iowa's rolling that out to the whole state. So thank you very much for saying that. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've struggled with. Oh no, first we're going to do Amelia's, we'll share a little bit about pushback. So the changes that these brave leaders have made in their communities have not always been fully embraced. So Amelia will talk a little bit about that.
We'll talk a little bit about that. It can be summed up to say change is hard for all of us, right? For the human condition. And there is a strong inertia towards the status quo. And so it is so important to talk about the pushback of change, that we actually pulled the cohort release, the year 1 study, and added a whole section on guidance for leaders. Leadership on the Line is one of our really important professional guidebooks by Heifetz and Linsky out of Harvard about the backlash of disruptive innovation. And we are witnessing so much backlash around the country, not just in cohort agencies, but in many jurisdictions who are trying to do change work, that we felt it important to be in touch with them. So we have actually been running some of this work by them and talking with them about the backlash of change. You know, in the addendum that we've added to the cohort study, there is much more information on the guidance that we have for leaders around the backlash of change. And I'm going to just say them really, really quickly and invite you to read more about it there. You know, the first is that this is an adaptive rather than a technical challenge. So there's no manual, there's no right way, there's no expert. And so you must do to learn. And that takes a great amount of bravery in a leader. And so we have enormous respect for people who are engaging in that change. A really big theme is that change shows up as loss, right? It's the loss of expertise, the loss of control, the loss of safety, the loss of power. And so really using a trauma-informed, empathetic approach for people who are faced with needing to live with the shifts and changes is really important. There's a big fear of the unknown, and that shows often up by folks as a worry that if you make these changes, keep families together, kids aren't safe, which is not what the data shows actually. But just to acknowledge that people have a fear of the unknown. Another is thinking about where the resistance originates. And frankly, we've seen resistance in systems from almost every aspect, depending on the culture and community. It's come from foster parents, nonprofit leaders, police, school, county board of supervisors, you name it. And it really depends on the culture of the place. So just to say it can come from a lot of places. We really lean into difficult relationships. That's another piece of guidance, is that we really try hard. And I think this is a piece of wisdom from Heifetz and Linsky on Leadership Online, was try hard to understand the other person's story. Everybody's going to bed at night saying they're doing right by kids. They're doing the best thing for families in their community. So what's the story they're telling about why the way they're thinking to keep it the same as it was, why might that be true for them? And to really learn people's stories and again, kind of take a trauma-informed approach even with partners. Of course, taking care of yourself and your team. Diane outlined for us, expanding the group of helpers, including more people, because you cannot do this alone, as Lori outlined. And then one of the most important things we've learned is that you've got to make a case for change. And the leaders are so busy making the change that taking the time to really think about what is our counter narrative? How do we explain when people say, you're not doing your job because you used to take kids and now you're not, you people do nothing anymore. What is the other side of that story? What is the data story? What's the qualitative story from our families? And how do we make the case that the change is valuable and important? So, you know, Simon Sinek talks about starting with why. And this is just a hard learning, is really starting with why. People need to understand the why of the change, because it's so much easier to stay as is than to change things. So they've got to have just a compelling sense of why it's important to do this, and building the counter narrative in qualitative and quantitative ways help to illustrate that story are incredibly important.
Thank you, Amelia. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the real struggles that we've had, and then want to move into Q&A. I know, Corey, I'd love for you to talk about the risk tolerance. We had another question about FFPSA, if we have questions about safety data. Here's places we've really struggled, friends. And you can read more about this in the case study, but in our anti-racism in the cohort has been a part of our conversation, but in maybe this is Katie's assessment, has been more on the periphery than it should be. The areas that we are, the 5 agencies that we are in are mostly white. Our leaders are white. And of course we understand that there is, the communities didn't always start out that way, and so there's history for us to learn and integrate. There are more courageous conversations that we need to have in our group about how anti-racism works in rural agencies, that it works among this group, and we have not done as good a job as we need to on that. Also, really including constituent voice. We've had a challenge with the trickle down of vision. Sometimes it feels so real and right on, and yes, we can do this, and I know how to do it. I'm setting a vision in the leadership, and then the farther and farther away it gets, sometimes the staff can find themselves being like, I don't really know what you want me to do. And that's been sometimes a disconnect. Capturing data across agencies has been a challenge for us. And then simply the lack of community resources. Sometimes when we know there's something else that a family needs, then what it is, the tool in our toolbox, it just isn't there. So what do you do then? Of course, each one of these and all of the topics that we've covered so far, we could spend a whole webinar on, of course, but want to get to what your comments and questions are. While you are talking, Anna from our team at Aaliyah is going to post a brief poll. That would be another way to perhaps indicate where you might want some more information. So you can move that out of your way, or maybe I need to do that, but that might be helpful for us. It will be helpful for us for sure, but to kind of categorize where we could go deeper, where we could talk more about this. But I will go ahead and open it up. If you have a question that you would like to pose to the group or one of the particular presenters or to Aaliyah, that would be really helpful. Corey, do you want to start us off with just what you've mentioned about risk tolerance and fortitude?
Yeah, quickly, Katie, and thank you, and good to see everybody. I just start with, where we've struggled with the anti-racism work, to also understand that, inherent in our systems, there's a narrative of racial inferiority that we are, or have been, through evidence to be afraid to look at. So with the data showing that there is overrepresentation of Black and brown, poor white families in our systems, we must, one, recognize that Blackness or, non-white is not a risk factor. And also, Amelia touched on the point that our systems are driven to save and rescue. We must become very comfortable with the reality that that is not our role. If we continue to look at families as if they're broken, will always feel compelled to save and fix and rescue them. That's not our job. So how might we continue to live with a lot more risk? Because if we're going to move into a pre-crisis mindset, or prevention, some are calling it, we must recognize that families are messy, that things will happen, and that we cannot prevent everything as much as we would like to believe we can. Living in reality will build the fortitude that we need from a leadership perspective. So that's briefly some of the conversations that we've had around the cohort table, and we're doing some work to really understand how we build that risk tolerance through utilization of data. And Amelia touched on the mixed methods of that safety data.
Just we are really looking at risk and safety because we're going to have to change our definition and our tolerance, as you're saying, Corey, right? And so, and to think about more, frankly, than physical safety, to think about the absolute trauma of disrupting a child's sense of belonging does, and the lifelong impact of that, of bursting the bubble that, your family is your only place, or the place where even if bad things happen, it's the place you know. So really thinking very carefully about risk and safety, because we all desperately want children to be safe. And the truth is, all children are at risk, right? In some way. And children are never more at risk than when they are out of the care of their family. And so just really thinking about those concepts in new ways is going to be really critical, I think, to this building a counter narrative for the importance of this change, because we have absolutely not kept children safe through our public child welfare system. We have absolutely caused additional lifelong predictive harm in the ways in which we have done our work, but that doesn't really get acknowledged. So thanks for bringing that up. Anyone else? Katie, maybe we could put up a slide about what else we have coming up too.
can do. I know it can be a bit intimidating to click off mute on your computer and pop on, but feel free to. I've gotten a couple private messages. I've had somebody that was interested in particular in the more about the child safety conferences. So I know that Lori would, and folks on her team would be happy to share more about that, can do that at a later date. We have a couple of more webinars coming up, one in August and one in October. We have some publications coming out. There is a particular, that has emerged for us at ALEA, particular phases, I mean, that you will have seen reflected in what we talked about today about how you go about this work and what must you do first. Diane talked about it. Take care of yourself and your team, and then you can think differently, and then you can do things differently. And there's approaches to engage in your community throughout these phases. But we wanted to share out with you some of the phases that we've learned. And yeah, Kathy posted in the chat, is ALEA connecting with the new Upend movement to address racism in child welfare? And for sure, we need to work with those folks. I know that the CSSP has been at this work in that particular way longer than we have, and we have things to learn from them and want to partner with them in every way that we can. So thanks for sharing that. There's a couple of other initiatives around well-being and community work that we're just so thrilled to see, other efforts that we can be challenged by and elevate to. If you have other ideas and ways and approaches or groups, let us know.
If I may, just one more thing, since everyone's kind of silent there. ALEA, fundamentally believes in, families at the center. And I know we didn't have much time today, but the cohort wouldn't be what it is without the experiences of those who have gone through the system in one way or another. Not just from a workforce perspective, but those who have experienced the overwhelming, daunting, racist systems that work together interconnectedly to produce some of the outcomes that we see. We know that on average, 20,000 children leave our systems annually, not connected. And to this point that someone made about how are you helping families reconnect that have been separated? I mean, that's a big question. We're talking reunification, or are we talking about children or youth or young adults who have left our systems and now are attempting to reconnect? All of those things are being learned through our do tank in the cohort. And without lived experience guides at the center driving that work, I doubt we'll be as far as we are today. So just wanted to elevate that point that this is a true partnership, a real strategic collaborative, where we're churning new ideas to do things extremely and radically different, while centering family every step of the process.
Thanks for that, Corey. That's right. And so I think you referred to the D tank, which is, we say we're not a think tank, we're a do tank. We've come to the end of what we can know by our task force and work plans and committees and talking about it. Frankly, we've been talking about it for decades. We've been admiring the problem. We all know it has to change. Everybody knows. If you don't have that realization yet, you're way behind the train. The question is how, right? And the answer to how has to be using the best of what we know by trying it, learning from it, adjusting, and going back at it again. And so we have a bias towards action. The people in the cohort, all of us, really have a bias towards action and use a do tank mentality. We learn, iterate, try again, and do all of it by building empathy with the people who are most close to and affected with the challenges, and by working as hard as we can to not bring a we know best paternalistic approach, but a family design, community design, along, with folks closest to the problem to help to support them, because families know what they need. They've been asking us for years, frankly, years and years, and we keep sending them to therapy.
Guys, thank you so much for joining this call. Please, 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 if you would, answer the poll. We're really keen to hear about what you're interested in further. We hope to connect with you. Please email us, give us a call. There's download and read the report. Ask us any questions. We're really open to hearing other feedback that you have. Any one of our cohort leaders or guide, I'm sure would be happy to have a chat with you about what you might be trying to do in your agency or questions about this. So we're just really an open book about what we're trying to do and want to match up with what y'all are trying to do and be challenged by you. And so thank you so much for your time. And please continue to be in touch with us. We'll be in touch with you. Sign up for the next 2 webinars. Again, there's one in August and one in October. And through the poll and your comments in your community, we will decide what we're going to cover in there. So thanks for all your work and just really in keeping families and kids safely together.
Thank you. This is terrific.
Everybody.
Thanks so much, guys.